You cannot see visceral fat. You cannot feel it. You cannot pinch it. It has no surface, no edge, no visible shape. It grows, silently packed between your internal organs, wrapped around your liver, stuffed behind your stomach, layered over your intestines, and the only signal it sends is the slow, steady breakdown of every metabolic system it touches. Most people trying to lose belly fat are fighting the wrong battle. They are focused on subcutaneous fat, the soft layer under the skin that you can grab with your fingers. That fat is cosmetic. It is uncomfortable. But it is not the one quietly raising your blood pressure, driving your insulin resistance, and accelerating your biological age. Visceral fat is. And there are 5 distinct types, each stored in a different location, each driven by a different hormonal mechanism, and each requiring a different approach to remove. Do you carry weight specifically around your midsection, even when the rest of your body looks relatively lean? Comment yes or no. Because the type of visceral fat you are carrying determines exactly what your body needs to clear it. This channel exists to give you the science your doctor never had time to explain. Subscribe so you never miss what is coming next. Type 1 Omental fat. This is the most common and most studied type of visceral fat. The omentum is a sheet of fatty tissue that hangs from your stomach and drapes over your intestines like an apron. When omental fat accumulates, it is the primary driver of what most people recognize as a hard belly, not soft, not squishy, but firm and protrusive even when relaxed. Omental fat is the most metabolically active visceral fat in your body. It sits directly adjacent to your portal vein, the blood vessel that feeds your liver. When omental fat cells release their inflammatory compounds and free fatty acids, those substances travel directly into your liver through the portal circulation. No detour, no dilution. Straight to the organ responsible for your metabolism, your cholesterol production, and your blood sugar regulation. This direct line to the liver is why omental fat accumulation is so strongly associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, elevated triglycerides, and insulin resistance. The liver is being continuously bathed in the inflammatory output of the fat sitting right next to it. What drives omental fat specifically? Cortisol. The stress hormone has a uniquely high density of cortisol receptors in omental tissue, more than any other fat depot in the body. Chronically elevated cortisol from poor sleep, psychological stress, or aggressive daily fasting without recovery days preferentially deposits fat in the omentum. It is one of the primary reasons that stressed, sleep-deprived people develop belly fat even when their diet is relatively controlled. The fix for omental fat is not caloric restriction alone. It requires cortisol normalization, consistent sleep, fasting variation rather than daily rigid windows, and the specific insulin-lowering effect of time-restricted eating that allows the omentum to finally release what cortisol told it to store. Type 2 Hepatic fat. Hepatic fat is fat stored directly inside the liver itself, not around it, inside it. This is what becomes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease when it accumulates beyond the liver's capacity to manage it. Your liver is not designed to store fat. Its job is to process fat, to convert fatty acids into energy, to package triglycerides for transport, to regulate what gets stored and what gets burned. When the liver becomes a fat storage organ, every one of these functions degrades simultaneously. Hepatic fat accumulation begins when 2 things happen together: excess dietary carbohydrates that the liver converts to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis, and chronically elevated insulin that prevents the liver from releasing that fat back into circulation. The liver fills up, and a liver full of fat processes insulin less efficiently, which raises circulating insulin, which prevents more fat from being released. A self-reinforcing cycle that tightens with every passing month. What makes hepatic fat particularly dangerous is that it is invisible on the outside. You can have significant hepatic fat accumulation with a flat stomach and a normal BMI. The only reliable indicators are elevated liver enzymes on a blood panel, a feeling of fullness or pressure in the upper right abdomen, and the subtle but measurable fatigue that comes from a liver running at reduced efficiency. Hepatic fat responds strongly to 2 specific interventions: extended fasting windows that deplete liver glycogen fully and force the liver to burn its own stored fat for energy, and significant reduction in refined carbohydrates that feed de novo lipogenesis. It is one of the fastest responding visceral fat depots when fasting is practiced correctly. Measurable improvements have been documented in as little as 2 weeks of consistent time-restricted eating. If you have felt unexplained fatigue, seen elevated liver enzymes on a recent blood test, or simply carry weight predominantly in your upper abdomen, this may be the type hiding inside you. Type 3 mesenteric fat. The mesentery is the connective tissue that anchors your intestines to the back wall of your abdominal cavity and carries the blood supply that feeds your entire digestive system. Mesenteric fat grows within this tissue, threaded between the blood vessels that supply your gut. This type of visceral fat is the most directly connected to systemic inflammation. Mesenteric fat cells release adipokines signaling molecules that travel through the intestinal blood supply and reach the systemic circulation within minutes. Among these is interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor, alpha-2, of the most studied drivers of chronic low-grade inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation is not the inflammation you feel after an injury. It is silent. It runs at a level below the threshold of conscious sensation. But over years, it systematically degrades insulin receptor sensitivity throughout the body, accelerates the oxidation of LDL cholesterol, and drives the epigenetic changes associated with accelerated biological aging. Mesenteric fat is also uniquely responsive to the composition of the gut microbiome. Research has shown that dysbiosis, an imbalance in gut bacteria driven by highly processed diets, frequent antibiotic use, and poor sleep specifically promotes mesenteric fat deposition by increasing intestinal permeability and the translocation of bacterial endotoxins into the portal circulation. Fasting is particularly effective against mesenteric fat for this reason. Extended fasting windows allow the migrating motor complex, the gut's internal cleaning wave that only activates in the fasted state, to sweep the intestinal environment, reduce bacterial translocation, and directly lower the inflammatory signaling that drives mesenteric fat accumulation. Type 4 pericardial fat. Pericardial fat sits directly around the heart between the heart muscle and the pericardial sac that surrounds it. It is the visceral fat type most directly associated with cardiovascular risk, and unlike the other types, it cannot be detected by appearance at all. What makes pericardial fat particularly significant is its proximity. Fat tissue directly adjacent to the heart releases inflammatory compounds that affect coronary artery function, promote arterial stiffness, and have been associated with atrial fibrillation in multiple large population studies. The heart is surrounded by metabolically active inflammatory tissue, and the two are in constant biochemical communication. Pericardial fat accumulation is strongly correlated with the same drivers as omental fat, cortisol elevation, insulin resistance, and poor sleep quality. But it responds specifically well to the growth hormone surge that occurs during deep sleep and extended fasting. Growth hormone is one of the few hormones that directly targets pericardial fat for mobilization, which is one of the strongest biological arguments for optimizing the nighttime fat-burning window discussed in a previous video. Type 5 pancreatic fat. Pancreatic fat is fat deposited inside and around the pancreas, the organ responsible for producing insulin. It is the least discussed type and arguably the most consequential for long-term metabolic health. The pancreas produces insulin in specialized cells called beta cells. When fat accumulates in pancreatic tissue, beta cell function degrades. The cells that are supposed to produce insulin on demand become embedded in inflammatory fat tissue that impairs their sensitivity and their output. This is one of the primary mechanisms through which visceral fat accumulation leads to type 2 diabetes, not through insulin resistance alone, but through the direct physical degradation of the organ that produces insulin in the first place. Pancreatic fat is the most difficult type to lose because it sits deepest and responds last. It requires the most sustained period of metabolic improvement, consistent fasting, cortisol normalization, and adequate protein intake to preserve the lean mass that drives insulin sensitivity before measurable reduction begins. The one thing all 5 types share: every type of visceral fat, omental, hepatic, mesenteric, pericardial, pancreatic, is driven by the same 2 root conditions: chronically elevated insulin that locks fat into storage, and chronically elevated cortisol that signals the body to preferentially store fat in visceral depots over subcutaneous ones. Fix the insulin environment through time-restricted eating. Fix the cortisol environment through sleep quality, fasting variation, and stress management. These two interventions do not target one type of visceral fat. They address the hormonal root cause of all five simultaneously. Which of these five types do you think is most relevant to what you are experiencing right now? Comment below. I want to know which one resonated most. And if you want to understand exactly how autophagy targets and clears visceral fat at the cellular level, that video is right here. Watch it next. Your body is not failing you. It has been waiting for the right information. Now you have it.